Welcome to my webinar, Secrets of Planning a Mixed Level Yoga Class. So what I'm going to talk about this evening is how to do the lesson plannings for yoga classes, and it's going to be very general information. So you can apply this to any style of yoga class, whether you're teaching vinyasa or hatha or yin yoga, restorative, anything under the sun, flow class, low flow, all of them, like whatever. So I can tell you a little bit about myself before we get started. So I am a 500-hour certified Viniyoga teacher. And so part of the Viniyoga training includes a lot about the science and art of planning sequences. So these are principles that can be applied to any kind of yoga, though obviously I have applied them mostly in Viniyoga practices. And in addition to that, I have experience teaching hatha classes and vinyasa classes and yin. Those are my other avenues. And when I teach a regular class or teach a private client, I integrate many different of those approaches depending on my client's needs and preferences. So for 8 years, I taught at Lifetime Fitness, which is a huge franchise of fitness clubs. And we had a branded style of vinyasa class that we taught. And all of those classes were available to students in a drop-in basis. So anybody can come to any kind of yoga class at any time. And so I got very, very familiar with and quite good at teaching vinyasa classes and pretty strenuous vinyasa classes to all levels of practitioners who had varying levels of experience and athletic experience too. So that is my background. So with that, I'll go ahead and get started. And if you have any questions along the way, you can put them in the chat box and I'll get a notification, and then I will respond at the end. I'll have plenty of time for questions and answers. So let's go ahead and get started. I'll share my screen with you. Okay, so here we go. Secrets of planning a mixed level yoga class. Spoiler alert, they're all mixed. So whether or not you are teaching a multi-level class, or you're teaching a beginner's class or intermediate class, an advanced flow class, generally people are going to come to the class time that works for them. And it doesn't matter what the class is called, they just need to get to yoga. They're gonna go Tuesday at 7 o'clock, no matter what is happening at that time. So, and even if you have a pretty regular crew of people that are always coming to your intermediate class or always coming to your advanced class, even those practitioners are going to have variations in how they feel and whether they're injured or sick. Everyone has different things that happen to them over the course of their lives and their experience of practicing yoga. So basically, when you are teaching a class, there's no way to know just by looking at people what is happening with your clients. And so it's best to assume that whoever's in the room is going to be just a variety of experience. So let's take a look at the basic sequencing principles that are going to be the foundation of how we plan a yoga practice. So I talked about this in more detail in the last free webinar that I offered. So if you need a link to that, just send me an email, flissy@omchantris.com, and you can get these principles reviewed in more detail. Otherwise, I'm going to go ahead and review these in the context of what they mean in a multi-level yoga class. So first thing is to start with a simple intention. So that's going to be what's driving the why behind your yoga class that day. So let's just, for the sake of discussion, say that you're going to teach a evening yoga class. It'll be a flow, let's say it's a slow flow class. And the intention is going to be to stretch the hamstrings. So then from that, you can think about what kind of postures you're going to include and start to think about the general arc of your class. And then you're going to remember that general fitness rules apply. And this is especially important when working with people with a variety of fitness and athletic ability and mobility. So you'll just kind of think about first making sure that you have a little bit of time at the beginning of practice to develop some mind-body connection, to lubricate the joints, and to warm up the big muscles before you start getting into any more complicated postures. And the next thing is to be aware of planes. And this is something that really makes a big impact on how strenuous or challenging a class is. And so when I say planes, I'm talking about the levels in relationship to the floor, your position in space. And so in this little diagram here, I have some examples of forward bends, so knees to chest laying on your back, versus child's pose, which is in a kneeling plane, versus a standing forward bend, versus a seated forward bend. And then I have just a prone laying on the belly. It's not a forward bend, it's just laying on your belly. So if you are teaching a practice, the more transitions you have up and down off the floor, the more complicated and strenuous it could be. And the fewer transitions you have up and down, the more simple and the less strenuous it will be. So if you're teaching a complicated vinyasa practice where you're going up and down from the floor a lot, even within one flow, you're going from seated to standing or even from supine to standing with a lot of repetition, that's going to be difficult for beginners to grasp. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but you just want to be aware of the fact that quick transitions up and down are going to be harder for people that are new to, maybe not even just new to yoga, but new to doing any kind of fitness movements. And ones that where you have maybe do a series of postures in one plane, it's going to be a little bit more accessible to people that are new to a practice, just because there's a little bit less up and down off the ground. And then it's going to be important to use proper preparation and compensation. And so, for example, if you're teaching a more experienced group of practitioners, and maybe you're teaching a class where people are either doing multiple yoga classes per week, or they are maintaining a strong home asana practice, or they're already very strong or very flexible, those people will require perhaps a little less preparation to get into more strenuous or more complicated postures. And then if you are newer to the practice, for one, you might not yet understand the how to get into the more complicated positions, and you might require a little bit more warming up to get the flexibility or just the body awareness to get into these more complicated positions. So it's especially important if you're going to be doing some more complex asanas in a practice to make sure that you properly prepare the body by doing some simpler postures first, and to make sure the body is nice and warm before you get into more complicated things. And along that similar line is to move from simple to complex. So simple forward bend, so if we were talking our simple intention was to stretch the hamstrings, then you might start with simple things like the standing forward bend that is illustrated here, a seated forward bend. before you get into any complex thing where you might have a standing forward bend, like Parshvattanasana, where you have your asymmetrical legs, one forward, one back with a bind behind the back, or if you have a seated forward bend where you're like in a half lotus with a bind. You'll make sure that you do simpler postures before you get into the complicated ones, not just to prepare for the body, but also to teach people the principles of getting into those positions. And then here's just a simple example of, if you're going from triangle pose, you're going to have a series of things before you get into a single-legged balance that has a bind behind the back. So same idea. You want to make sure that you have some simple things, some movements that are free before you get into a thing with a bind. And that also gives people the opportunity to choose along the way whether they want to go for these more complicated variations on postures. And then the final principle is to consider the risks versus the benefits. So again, some of these postures that you might use in a more advanced kind of practice, you might choose things that could have potential risks. Anytime you do a bind with the arms, there is risk to the shoulder joint because you're adding extra leverage with your arm. And there's other compensation patterns that can happen when you're doing more complicated postures. And those things aren't necessarily bad. You just want to be aware that those are risks, and so that you can prepare your sequences to address those as best as possible. So that includes using proper preparation and compensation. So you want to make sure that you stretch anything that could be overly compressed in those complicated postures, and just weigh the risks versus the benefits. So obviously there are benefits to some of these more complex postures. So like headstand and shoulder stand are both good examples of postures that have great benefits, but they can also be very challenging for beginners. So you just want to weigh like, okay, like how important is it really to do headstand in a class where maybe not everyone is able to do it today. So you might want to be open to the idea of using a different posture that has similar benefits with less risks. So that's just a quick overview, just some general principles to keep in mind when you're planning a class. And then how those things apply to planning a mixed level yoga class, which, as we mentioned at the very beginning, really, if you think about it, just about any class you teach is going to be incorporating, there's going to be a variety of levels of experience in a class. So proper preparation, proper use of preparation postures is key. So this is going to help make those more complicated postures more accessible to people that may have less experience. And so what does that mean? One thing to consider is the use of repetition and stay. So a common mistake that some teachers make is to immediately go into a more complicated variation of a posture. So for example, doing a side angle pose that goes right into both hands bound behind the back and staying there for 5-10 breaths without doing anything that leads up to that. So one of the things that you can do before you go into those long static holds of complicated things is doing some dynamic movement first. So doing some, maybe coming into triangle pose and going in and out of triangle pose to practice that lateral bending before you even hold in triangle or in side angle, to get the body a little bit more warm and get that mind-body connection, to learn how to start to make that shape before you go and hold it for a long time. And then also, you might try practicing some of these postures on your own, both dynamically and statically, because some postures get easier when you stay in them longer. So a good example of that is when you get into doing some seated postures, and you go into passive hold. So like a seated forward bend and you stay for several breaths. That can be more relaxing feeling. The time that you stay there can give the muscles a chance to relax. It gets easier as you stay. And then some postures get more challenging when you stay. So if you hold a seated forward bend for 10 breaths versus chair pose for 10 breaths, the chair pose staying there is going to be harder, more muscular, more strenuous, and the seated forward bend is going to be easier. So if you just kind of take a look at the postures that you use in a practice and think about which ones are going to be more strenuous, more challenging when you hold longer, and which ones are going to be more gentle when you hold longer versus when you move in and out of them. So just kind of being aware of the effects of dynamic versus static movement on different postures. And then also make sure that you are using your approach to postures first in a general way and then in a subtle way. So this includes both what I was mentioning earlier when you're using going from simple postures with like free movement in and out, no binds, to moving into postures that have binds that are more complex. This also goes into how you teach a posture, going first with the very general information versus the more subtle instruction for things. So if we're talking like our example that we gave at the beginning of, okay, we want to stretch hamstrings, then you want to give like the first forward bending postures that you do to work on stretching hamstrings. You might give some just very general instruction about how to move in and out of forward bends, what sort of effects you're looking for, what sensations your students might feel when they're doing those forward bends, to then further along in the practice, giving more detailed information and refining how you want them to move, and refining some of the details about like the rotation of the pelvis, or how straight or bent their legs are. So this goes not just to what postures are you using, but how you are instructing them, how you're teaching them in a class. And then very important is to plan options. So a good way to do this is to revisit those simple to complex progression. And you can always give people the opportunity to do the version, for example, that does not include a bind, to do the version that might make use of more props, and then add on the more complicated options. And what's very important when you are planning these options, to make people feel really the best they can, as satisfied as they can, and have a sense of accomplishment in the practice, is to make all of those options valid. So that, oh, if you can't do X, then do the easier version. Make them both have equal value. So make sure that you explain the benefits of the simpler versions, the benefits of using props, as well as the benefits of doing the complicated things. There's often in yoga classes this impression that the more flexible thing is the best to do, or the most complicated one is the best to do. So you want to make sure that you just give value to the simple variations also. And another way to give different options in a practice is to vary the load. And so this is a general fitness principle that you can use in a yoga practice when you're looking at postures. So a good example of this is a transition in a vinyasa from plank to chaturanga, or plank to laying flat on your belly. So a simple way to vary the load in chaturanga is to lower the knees to the ground rather than lowering down with your legs straight. So that's a way to vary load, is by bending the knees. Another way to vary the load is through use of props. And so You can use the blocks to bring the floor up to you. And so giving some options so that people are still getting the effects of doing the posture with some modifications. And then another way to give some options for people is to change planes. And so I encourage you to take some of your favorite postures and think about how you would do them from a kneeling orientation or even a laying down orientation. So for example, if you do tree pose standing, how could you translate that to kneeling? How could you do tree pose laying on the floor? So people that can have the experience of the shape and change the relationship with gravity to make it less strenuous. And then of course, if you were to, for example, turn tree pose upside down and do it standing on your hands, that would obviously make it a lot more challenging. So by changing your relationship with gravity and your orientation in space, those are some ways that you can give some options for how you do your practice. Okay, and then so that gets into the how to plan your class in advance, what kind of postures you use, what kind of variations and options you can provide for those postures. Those are all things that you can do in advance of planning your class. And then what happens when you show up in class? That really can make a big difference. So there are many times as a yoga teacher where you might go in with a plan and then you show up and the people are in your class are not who you expect to be there, or the energy is different than you expect. You need to make changes to your plan for whatever reason. And this can happen on the fly in the moment. So it's good to have some tools to change your plan if you need to, which very frequently happens. So an approach to teaching that I find really helpful is to deliver layers of information in the following way. So first, by giving a breath cue. So inhale, do this, exhale, do that, and then give the movement. And the way that I like to give those movement cues and description of how to get into things is going to be pretty specific and anatomical and simple as possible. So inhale, let's say we're going into our, we're talking about stretching the hamstrings was our demo class idea. So if you're thinking about, let's go into a standing forward bend, inhale, reach your arms up, exhale, bend your knees a little, rotate your pelvis forward as you fold forward over your legs. So you're gonna give pretty specific direction and simple cues. So keep it as simple as possible. I know a lot of yoga teachers are like, oh wow, I wish I had like more elegant or evocative or fancier cues for getting into and out of things. But really when it goes into making a practice easily understood by a wide group of people, keeping it as simple as possible for starters is really the best course of action. And then once you get that breath cue in there, once you get the general movement instruction, then you can give into details. And if you are someone that has a lot of metaphor for their instruction, that's a great time to start to give in those details about visualizations about how things might feel, or if you're in the yoga anatomy nerdy category like I am, some more details about anatomically what's going on. You might relate back to a philosophical intention that you have to the class. So first breath, then some simple movement direction, and then get into the details. And so, that detail part is third for a reason. So if people are having a difficult time understanding the movement directions that you're giving, then you want to continue to focus on that before you get into the bonus flowery stuff. And then as you're doing this, you want to observe what's happening in your class and then respond appropriately. So this is a piece that I see missing in a lot of more inexperienced yoga teachers. They'll go into class with a plan. They may have even rehearsed how they're instructing, moving into and out of different postures. And they're just going to stick with that plan and barrel through no matter what. But it's very important. This is what distinguishes a teacher from someone who is simply instructing, is this ability to see what's going on in the class and then change their instruction as needed. So if you see that people are not understanding what you're saying about something, or they're not understanding a cue, they're not getting a movement principle that you're trying to teach, then you want to find a different way to say it. Or if you're like, ooh, I had planned this very complicated practice, or I have a really difficult posture is going to be my peak posture, and the people that I have today are just not going to be able to do it, then you want to just be able to change your plan and maybe even do something completely different. And that goes right into be open to change. So, you know, you might have a just beautiful, well thought out practice. And if that is just not going to serve the people that are in front of you that day, you need to be open to change it. And that's going to be better for everyone. You're going to be a lot more relaxed because you're not going to be stressing out about trying to make people do something that you want them to do. And your students are going to have a much better experience too. Because if they're not able to do something, they're going to get really frustrated about it. And if you instead change your plan to something that's going to be more relaxing for them, more fun to them, more accessible to them, they're going to have a better experience too. If you change what you're doing so that they're able to learn better, they're just going to have a much better time. So just be open to changing your plans so that you can serve your students better. And that's really our job as teachers. We are in service of our students. And I just added this quote here, which is one of my favorites from Paul Grilly, who is a yin yoga teacher. He likes to say all variations are legal. So, you know, especially being open to change is not strictly to applicable to the entire group. It's also be open to adapting things for an individual. So you might have 10 people doing one thing, and you might have one person doing something different. You might have two people doing a third thing. So if you can go back to the beginning of why you're doing your practice, that main simple intention that you set at the beginning, then it is easier to make those changes and to adapt to your students. And if you can go back around to that main intention, then it's easier to adapt things to meet your students' needs, and you'll have maybe different variations of one posture happening at a time, and they are all legal. So that kind of gives you some ideas about how to plan a single class, and also how to teach your classes in a way that's going to be more accessible to many levels of experience. And then, so, okay, what happens for long-term planning? So if you have a class that's going every Tuesday morning, 9:30, you're teaching a mixed level class or an all levels class, then, oopsies, hold on, am I still sharing? Yeah, there we go, okay. So over the long term, how do you plan a class that has many levels of experience. So what's important is to embrace repetition. So I think many yoga teachers feel the need to always make things really exciting and to have like a new cool flow every week. And that's a great, and it's also great to repeat the fundamentals. So there's so many fundamental movements that are going to be great to repeat every time you're on the mat. So developing a mind-body connection, being able to connect breath and movement together, and doing some foundational postures so that you're able to track your progress over time. Those are all great things to do, to just do every time you do a practice. And so you might not do the same class every single time, but consider keeping a few chunks of the class the same. So for example, I have a handful of opening sequences that I will use almost all of the time. So as a Vinyasa teacher, Chakravakasana or Vajrasana, so kneeling forward bend from child's pose to hands and knees, or from child's pose to standing on the knees. Just about every class I teach starts with one of those, because it's so great for connecting breath and movement together and simply warming up the spine. So I encourage you to find a chunk of class that makes sense to repeat. Maybe not every week, but maybe to have 3 or 4 opening sequences, or 3 or 4 finishing sequences that you do at the end of a practice that you can use week to week. So this does a couple things for you. One, it makes class planning easier for you, so you don't always have to be thinking of new things. It's going to save you time. And then it's going to be good for your students too. It'll allow them to track their progress over time. It will allow them to actually learn how to do some basic movement skills. And it will also give them a sense of comfort about their class. So if you go to yoga class and you don't know what's going to happen when you're there, that's a totally different feeling than if you're like, oh, like I'm going to show up and I know I'm going to feel better. I know I'm going to sit down and the lights are going to be dim, and I'm going to do some breathing, and then I'm going to do some simple movements. It gives you a sense of security when you're going to your practice, knowing that some of the things are going to be the same. And if you don't have chunks of the class that are exactly the same, you might still have like a general arc of the class that's going to be the same. So a lot of vinyasa or flow classes will have a similar format week to week. So you know that you're always going to do sun salutations. You know you're always going to do some seated poses at the end. So think about either having a arc of your class that is continuous week to week, or having a few chunks of the class that repeat week to week. And then another thing you can do is use variations on core postures. And so, for example, we look at triangle pose. You can do triangle pose just sort of standard with arms straight. You can do different arm positions. You can add a bind. You can experiment with the foot position and different things. So, and again, like I mentioned, you could try, you know, how can you do triangle pose kneeling? How could you do triangle pose laying on your back? So you can use, take one posture and explore different variations on it. You can use different approaches to get in and out of it. So you can teach people things about some core postures by teaching them in different ways, or by teaching different variations. And that's another way to reinforce the options you might be providing in your class. Oh yeah, so as I mentioned, you can teach different elements of the same posture week to week. So if we go back to thinking about triangle pose, you can think about the lateral bend element. You can think about the leg or hip stretching element of that. You can talk about the different compensations that might show up in triangle pose, so displacing the shoulders or the hips. You can use props. So if you teach different elements of the same posture week to week, even if you use the same poses, you'll always be teaching new materials. So that will help people that are regulars and coming all the time get a broader and deeper understanding about postures that you're using. And if you have someone that's new to the practice, they're also going to be learning. So everyone's going to be kind of learning at the same time. They're going to all, week to week, you'll get a different perspective on some of the same material. And then you can teach simple to complex over a longer period of time. This is particularly useful if you're teaching in a scenario where you might be able to teach a 12-week session about back bends or whatever. And even if you're in a scenario like a gym where people are coming and going all the time, you don't really know who's going to show up when, still you might over like 4 weeks focus on forward bends and be able to teach a progression of simpler to more complicated forward bends over a series of a few weeks. Even if you don't ever say that's what you're doing to your students, you can plan that arc for yourself week to week, and you'll have just an approach to doing some different material. So that's what I got for teaching mixed level classes. And if you have any comments or questions, you can add those in the chat box. And if any questions come up over the replay, if you're watching this on the replay, you can go ahead and send me an email at flissy@omenchantress.com, and I'll be happy to answer your questions about planning mixed level yoga classes or anything yoga sequencing. So what you just witnessed, what you just participated in tonight is a little snippet of my Yoga Sequencing Secrets online course. And so this is a 6-week online course that begins March 11th. That's next Monday night. So every Monday night at 8:30, there will be a webinar, much like this one, recorded and available for you to download. So I'll post the replay on Tuesday at some point. So the price goes up tomorrow. The VIP pricing for tonight, it's $95. It goes up to $125 tomorrow. And the sequencing course includes my How to Draw Yoga Stick Figures course for free, and that's usually $45. And the first 20 participants also get a free 30-minute sequence review call, and that is, there's a few more spots available for that. So basically that's a 30-minute coaching call where I can take a look at one of the sequences that you prepared through the course and the tools that you learned, and give you feedback about it. So if you have any questions, if there's a specific kind of class that you teach, you're like, oh, I don't really know how these tools apply to teaching my seniors class or whatever, I can talk you through some of the details of whatever your personal needs are in terms of planning a yoga class. So that's what I got. So if you have any questions for me, I'm here for you. You can send me an email at flissy@omenchantress.com. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in my sequencing course. And you can also visit my website, www.yogawithflissy.com. Thanks for watching. Bye.